Michigan State Representative James Talarico is one of the youngest elected members of the state legislature. He's a former teacher who was first elected to the Texas House of Representatives back in 2018 and currently serves District 50, which covers parts of Austin and Pflugerville. He is a proud Christian who credits Jesus for being the reason why he's in politics. However, he has been critical of legislation that pushes Christian ideology, including a bill that requires the Ten Commandments to be displayed on classroom walls. State Representative James Talarico, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Representative Talarico, so Senate Bill 10 would mandate the display of the Ten Commandments in all of Texas public school classrooms. You are in seminary, and you're also a former public school teacher, yet you have been one of the bill's fiercest critics. Tell us why you think this would not be a good idea.
Well, I think this bill is not only unconstitutional, un-American, I also think it's deeply unchristian because, we as believers should be bringing policies that seek to feed the hungry, heal the sick, welcome the stranger, serve the poor. But instead of working on those policies, we're trying to force teachers to put up a poster. And that's what gives religious people a bad name. It's what gives Christians a bad name because people see us as using our power to impose our beliefs on other people against their will rather than trying to help people. And so that's why I think this bill is dangerous, again, not only to our Constitution and the separation of church and state, but also dangerous to our religion and our faith.
What do you say to parents who would argue that we are a Christian nation, we were built on Christian foundation, and that understanding this important text in the entire development of our nation should be on display in classrooms outside of simply the religious implications of it?
Well, there are standards in our education system that already require that our educators teach students about the Ten Commandments, teach students about the Bible, as well as other world religions. That's important to understanding American culture and history, as well as the history and cultures of other countries around the world. So no one is disputing that. I think what we're having a debate about is whether or not our government should be uplifting one religious tradition over the others. And, any, I think, understanding of American history, leads us to recognize that our founders did not create a Christian nation. They created a nation where we are free to be Christians, but we're also free to be Jews and Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims and Sikhs and atheists. America was started by religious minorities fleeing religious persecution, and that's why the very first amendment in our Constitution creates a separation between the institutions of the church and the state in the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. And so this kind of bill, I think, does a great disservice to our Constitution and our founders who wrote that Constitution.
With that understanding, what are you hearing from the other side of the aisle on this? Because what you say sounds perfectly logical. Why would they have a different point of view? What is their position?
Well, I try to take everyone at their word about why they're doing something. But I've heard that we need to put the Ten Commandments in every classroom because it's so foundational. There are a lot of documents that are foundational to our country, including the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution itself. In fact, I asked the bill author last week in committee, why not mandate that the Constitution be posted in every classroom, in every public school? And she couldn't give me an answer. And so the only thing I can assume is that there are legislators trying to use their power, their governmental power, to elevate their religious tradition over others because they're worried about, folks not going to church as much as they used to, or folks not being religious like they used to. And so they think using the power of the state will help bring people back to church. And I get that. I get that fear. I see a lot of gray hair at my church too, and I have that fear about the future of a lot of our faith communities. But I just passionately believe that this is not the way to solve that problem. In fact, I think this will have the opposite effect. I think instead of creating a new generation of Christians, I think this kind of policy will create a whole new generation of atheists, because students will see our religion as more about power than it is about love.
Representative Talarico, now looking at this from a logistics standpoint, lawmakers who are in favor of SB 10 say this would have zero financial impact on the school districts, that these posters would be donated. So to a certain extent, they're saying no harm, no foul. The Ten Commandments are a great foundation, as we were just talking about. What do you say to that when they're saying this isn't going to really have that big of a harm and these are great, rules to live by? Put them up in the classroom.
Well, I, as a former teacher, always think about the students who are left out. And as a Christian, I always think about the people who are left out. Jesus is always asking us to be concerned about the outcast, the stranger, the oppressed. And it's really hard to be a Muslim kid in Texas public schools. It's hard to be a Hindu kid in Texas public schools. It's hard to be different when you're a kid. And when you're going to schools in the United States, and especially here in Texas, where Christianity is the dominant religion and the dominant culture, you stick out when you don't belong to that religion. And now the government, the politicians of the state capitol, are going to force your teacher to put a poster on the wall of your classroom that says, "Thou shalt not worship any other god before me." I mean, I'm not a Hindu, but I worry about how that will make a Hindu student feel. And I think it will make them feel unwelcome. Again, that's un-American, and it is deeply un-Christian.
We're also hearing reports about SB 11, which would carve out time for prayer or religious reading in the school day. In one way, that would seem to also go against wanting to put the Ten Commandments in, because once again, you'd go against this too. But on the other side, what could be argued is, well, now there's time for anyone to read whatever religious texts they want and to pray however they want during the school day. It's a nice companion piece. Your thoughts on that?
Well, there will always be prayer in school. As long as there are pop quizzes, there will be prayer in school. But what we're talking about here is government coerced prayer, government mandated prayer. And again, this should be deeply concerning to religious people, because the separation of church and state doesn't just protect the state, doesn't just protect our democracy, it also protects the church. It protects faith communities. I mean, my granddad was a Baptist preacher in South Texas, and Baptists were some of the fiercest defenders of the separation of church and state throughout American history. Thomas Jefferson first uses that phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, in a letter to the Danbury Baptists, because he was trying to speak their language. And the Baptists were very concerned that when the government starts to teach our religion, when the government starts to decide which religion is correct or which interpretation is correct, that's incredibly dangerous for faith communities and for the church. We cannot allow the government to usurp the role of the church. We cannot allow government employees, government bureaucrats, to usurp the role of pastors and Sunday school teachers. And so this kind of bill is incredibly dangerous, not just to our Constitution, not just to our democracy, not just to our students, but also to believers and Christians in particular.
If I don't misunderstand the bill, my reading of it is that it's not instructed. It's just a time when the students can do their own reflection on their own religions. In that particular, if I'm interpreting it correctly, what is so bad about that from your point of view?
Well, that already exists. No one is trying to stop a Christian student, a Muslim student, a Hindu student from praying in school. What we're concerned about is government employees coercing that prayer in school and leading that prayer in school in their position as government employees. And that's a very important line that we don't want to cross. Of course, students of faith should be able to pray in school. I prayed in school all the time as a student. I pray in my job at the state capitol all the time. There's no way I could get through a day without prayer. It's what sustains me and powers me through the day. And I hope that's true for students of all faith backgrounds. But what we can't allow is the government using its incredible power to mandate or force or lead those prayers.
So, Representative Talarico, you're in seminary. you're a Christian. How do you justify that to Republican lawmakers who are saying we are just trying to implement these good things into our public school systems, and you should essentially be aligned with this because you believe in all of these things. You believe in prayer. You believe in reading your Bible and the teachings of Christ. What do you say to people that ask you those questions?
Yeah, I would encourage them to have a more confident faith. God doesn't need the Texas Legislature. Jesus doesn't need the Texas Legislature. The teachings of our religion stand on their own. They have survived for 2,000 years on their own merits, and that's, I think, something that we should be proud of. We don't need bills to protect or strengthen the teachings of Jesus. We don't need legislation to strengthen Christianity, and in fact, we are endangering our faith when we use governmental power, state power, to try to impose our beliefs on other people. And it's just contrary to everything Jesus taught us to be, humble and meek and servants. That is what we are called to be as followers of Jesus. We are not called to use the power of government to force people to do something against their wills. And so I think I'm being consistent in my role as an elected official and also as a Christian.
To take a broader look at all of this, are you concerned with the amount of attention that the Texas Legislature is putting on this religiosality, this Christian approach to education in our state?
Yes. I never thought I would talk so much about religion in this role as a public official. My faith is the reason I ran for office, because I was taught at a very young age that I had to follow two commandments: love God and love neighbor. Those are the two commandments that Jesus gives us as Christians. And serving in this public role is a way for me to love my neighbor by helping to bring down healthcare costs and fund our neighborhood public schools and create more access to childcare. That's how I, as a Christian, am trying to love my neighbors. But I never thought I would talk explicitly about my religion in this public role. But I've been forced to do so because of these Christian nationalist bills that are trying to blur the lines between separation of church and state. I think about my first day in office. I put my hand on our family Bible, which means so much to me and so much to my family, and I raised my other hand and swore an oath to the Constitution. But it wasn't the other way around. I didn't put my hand on the Constitution and swear an oath to uphold the Bible. And I think we've got to understand that distinction, because I am a Christian, but I understand the most dangerous form of government is theocracy, because the only thing worse than a tyrant is a tyrant who thinks they're on a mission from God. And so, my faith in Jesus leads me to reject theocracy, reject Christian nationalism, and recommit myself to the project of a multiracial, multicultural democracy where we can all freely love God and fully love our neighbors.
Focusing on legislation, what bills do you think we should be looking at and moving forward in Austin, in Texas?
Well, again, Matthew 25, which is one of my favorite verses of Scripture, tells us exactly how we will be judged and how we will be saved, and that's by feeding the hungry, healing the sick, welcoming the stranger, visiting the prisoner. And so I try to bring bills to the floor that do those things, that help the least of these in our state. And I wish that more of my fellow Christians in the Texas Legislature would do the same.
There have been a few very public school bills that have been floating around, HB 2 and SB 2. I'm curious on your views on school vouchers and special ed. How is all of that working out?
Well, I led the fight against Greg Abbott's private school voucher scam because it will defund our public schools across the state and use our tax dollars to subsidize the private education of the wealthy few. These private schools are able to pick and choose what students they let in. And that's their right as a private school. I have no problem with private schools. There are great private schools around the state that do good work, but they aren't the same thing as a public school because they can decide who they admit and who they reject. And if we're going to use taxpayer dollars to subsidize these private schools, then they should be open to everybody. And what you see in most states that try these voucher scams is that the vast majority of the funding ends up going to wealthier parents who are already sending their kids to private school. So instead of sending billions of dollars to our underfunded public schools to give teachers a pay raise, to improve curriculum, to lower class sizes, instead we're sending billions of dollars to parents who are already sending their kids to private school so they can get a discount on their tuition. It's welfare for the wealthy, and it's not a good use of our state dollars, in my opinion.
Well, I understand that. However, this law, it goes into effect in September. What are you thinking moving forward as a representative in your area? How are you going to work across party lines to make sure that these things aren't happening, the things that you technically say that you already know about?
Yeah, I mean, I worry it's too late for this bill because it's already been signed by the governor, and I think it will do tremendous damage to our schools and our communities around the state. But what I'm going to keep trying to do is fight to make sure that the legislature does right by our students in public schools and does right by our public school educators who are doing the hard work in our communities every day to change lives and improve student outcomes. That's what I've been doing since I got elected. It's what I'm going to keep doing despite this voucher scam passing and taking billions of dollars out of our public education system.
For those of us who live in the state of Texas, and we're seeing the time tick out on the legislature for this session, we see bills like the Furries Act being debated and voted on. And it makes me wonder, are we using our time most effectively on the things that really the legislature needs to be focused on? Or is there something else going on here at play?
Yeah, I have the same concern. You know, I questioned the author of this Furries Act. I feel a little silly even talking about this, but these are the bills that I'm asked to discuss and what are brought to committee and to the floor, unfortunately. But I asked the bill author if he had any evidence for students dressing up as cats and using litter boxes in our schools, which is exactly what he said is happening. It's what Governor Abbott said is happening around the state. It sounds alarming. I asked him to name a school where that's happening, and he couldn't name a school. The governor also couldn't name a school where that's happening. So this is a complete hoax that they are now writing legislation to address. And so I just don't think we should be writing bills based on debunked internet rumors. I think we should be writing bills that solve actual problems, lowering property taxes, funding our schools, fixing our water infrastructure, fixing our grid. You know, these are the problems that are facing the 30 million people of this state. And we don't need, culture wars that are divisive and based on non-existent problems.
As somebody who's playing in this sandbox, no pun intended, what is really at play here? They have to realize across the board where the concerns are in this state, where the financial issues lie in this state, where the education problems lie in this state. Why are these the bills that are getting attention? Why are they even being created?
Well, one thing I think it's important to remember is that because of redistricting, many legislators have districts that are overwhelmingly blue or overwhelmingly red. And so all those legislators have to do to get reelected is satisfy their primary base, their primary electorate, not the general electorate. And the people who vote in primaries tend to be more partisan than regular voters. And so they've got to, on the Republican side, they've got to feed up these red meat culture war issues so that they don't get primaried by someone who's farther to the right than they are. So this is a structural problem in our political system where we gerrymander districts to be incredibly partisan. We have primary elections that cater to the most extreme voters in the electorate. And that's what leads to this kind of ridiculous policymaking at the state capitol and this extremism that is doing great damage to our state. I'll also say that on the education front, this is part of a larger effort by very wealthy special interests, billionaire mega donors in particular. I think about Tim Dunn and Ferris Wilks and Betsy DeVos and Jeff Yass. they have executed a smear campaign against our public schools to justify privatization schemes like this voucher scam that just passed. And it's always been a two-step process. You've got to discredit public schools so that you can defund public schools. And that's why you've seen these attacks on our librarians, calling them groomers and banning books. That's why you've seen people attacking teachers, accusing them of indoctrination. That's why you saw this furries bill accusing schools of providing litter boxes to students. I mean, ridiculous stuff. It's all an elaborate, well-funded, manufactured smear campaign against our public schools so that these wealthy special interests can privatize the system and make money off of our kids.
Representative, thank you for sharing your views with us today.
James Talarico is the state representative for Texas District 50. Again, Representative Talarico, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.